Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of September of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians continue intensifying their activity. We continue receiving additional updates from the territory between the village of Rabotina and Novodanilovka. During the previous 24 hours we got another additional batch of videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in this area. You know that we got used that the main clashes and the main activities in Ukraine are taking place in the Kursk direction and the Pokrovsk directions. Sometimes we have some activity in the Siversk direction, we have activity in the Ugledar direction, but we have almost forgot about such directions like Dnipro, like Zaporizhzhia, like maybe southern Kupiansk or something like this, and Chasiv Yar, and the most important, the Chasiv Yar direction, where the Russians were stopped, let's say at the 50% of the operation. And these days we start receiving additional updates exactly from these almost forgotten directions about additional Russian activity. For example, in the city of Stepnogorsk, the Russians attacked the Ukrainian positions. They destroyed the Ukrainian communication equipment. I know that this is not the only video from this area. We have already discussed that since the beginning of August the Russians were over-focused in this territory, almost bombing and attacking every single square kilometer in this territory. This picture shows us that most likely either the Ukrainians have concentrated here a significant number of forces and the Ukrainians are planning to begin the full-scale offensive operations towards the city of Energodar with the purpose to establish control over Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, or the Russians are planning to begin the full-scale offensives towards the city of Zaporizhzhia. And right before we start making the video, we got very interesting report that the Russians, more precisely the Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group, managed to improve their positions along the line of combat contact in the vicinity of the village by the name of Kamyanska. We will discuss this, let's say, episode during the next video. And from the other side, we also see some activity of Ukrainian artillery. For example, in this video, we can see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the position of Russian artillery system and how the Ukrainians destroyed the Russian system as a result of counter-artillery duel. So we will focus in this area. Most likely something big is going to happen during the next few weeks. Now let's move to the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. As we discussed in the previous video, currently there are very heavy clashes for the territory of the coal mine South Donbas number 3. Most likely the Russians will take under control this object during the next few days. Maybe the Russians have already established control. We're just waiting for another video with the Russian flag. But according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians conducted several counterattacks. Most of them were repelled. Ukrainians suffered losses and were forced to fall back. Furthermore, starting of the 15th of September, we start receiving first updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the village of Bogayavlenka. And correct me if I'm wrong, but something tells me that this is the first video since the beginning of the special military operation, how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces exactly in this area, so behind, which confirms that the Russians managed to bring artillery systems much closer to the line of combat contact, and that the Russians have already established complete control, artillery control over these supply roads that goes from Novoukrayinka to Bogayavlenka and from Uspenovka. So the Russians are about to complete the operational encirclement of the armored forces of the Ukrainian side of Ugledar. We have another video. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map between Vadiana, Katerinovka and Konstantinovka. In this video, we can see how the Russians were evacuating abandoned and damaged vehicle that the Russians were using during the previous attacks in this direction. As you can see, the Russians were evacuating their equipment under very heavy artillery fire. This video confirms that most likely a few days before this episode, the Russians were attacking the positions of Ukrainian forces and managed to capture additional territories. Furthermore, some sources reported that the Russians took under control these tree lines and these fields and the fortifications around 5 days ago, and just today we got the geolocations that confirm this. Now let's move further and let's talk about Kurakhova. The Kurakhova direction, we have additional changes on the ground on the territory of the village by the name of Maximilianovka. The Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russians in the southeastern part. This video confirms additional progress on the ground of the armed forces of Russian Federation, and based on this video, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps. So one of the episodes, one of the FPV drone strikes took place exactly in this point. So based on this, we have adjusted the map. There are still, we haven't received anything about these farms, and these farms, most likely the Russians are planning to first to secure the flanks and to secure the farms, and then they will continue moving further. The Russians need to get this central line, this street, this one, to have a straight connection with the Russian forces that are currently trying to clear the village of Khostre. So very interesting details. Now let's move further. As for Ukrainsk, we haven't received almost anything from this direction, just a short report from Ukrainian sources. The Ukrainians are on the ground, the Ukrainian soldiers, or I don't know, those who have connections with the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground, reported that rearguard battles continue in the central, northern and western parts of the city. There are also Ukrainian black units in the city. Work is currently underway to unblock them. There was something similar in Novogrodovka. The Ukrainian soldiers were unblocked, but the city was occupied in 96 hours, according to Ukrainian sources. So what is going on right now in this direction? The Russians, during the previous 24, 48, 72 hours, managed to establish operational encirclement of the city. The Russians broke through the Ukrainian defense belt in the northern part and in the southern part. But the Russians, most likely, they did have chances, they did have possibilities to complete the encirclement, to connect the northern with the southern part. The distance is around 2 kilometers, which is nothing, obviously, but the Russians decided not to do this because the Russians know for sure that Ukrainians will try to create or conduct the unblocking operation. And the Russians understand what is the reason to encircle these Ukrainians and to destroy this cauldron or to force them to fall back. If the Russians can wait and until the Ukrainians send additional forces inside of the cauldron with the purpose to unblock the first one. So that's why the Russians think that they can deal much damage to Ukrainians, much more damage to Ukrainian forces, and to destroy more units and more soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine during this unblocking operation. Meanwhile, while the Ukrainians are trying to create the plan, the Russians improve their flanks according to different mappers, because they understand to unblock the Ukrainians in Ukrainsk, the Ukrainians will attack the Russian flanks in the northern part and in the southern part. And both flanks, the positions on both flanks were improved by the Russians, and the Russians are ready for final battle for the Ukrainsk, where most likely the Ukrainians will suffer significant losses during this unblocking operation. So let's wait. Obviously, we can start counting maybe not even days but already hours before the Russians raise the flag on the landfill of the coal mine of Ukrainsk. Now let's move further. As for the line between Mikhailovka and Novogrodovka, we haven't received anything special, just the regular videos, regular FPV drone attacks. In this video we can see another video how the Ukrainians were trying to send additional reinforcements or additional sabotage or reconnaissance group towards the city of Novogrodovka, but the Ukrainians were discovered and destroyed as a result of FPV drone attack. As for the Pokrovsk itself, the city of Pokrovsk itself, we continue receiving different videos from different angles of how the consequences of Russian aviation and rocket strikes on the main support artery that goes from the north to the south and from the west to the east. This is the consequences of Russian attacks. The bridge was completely destroyed, the railways were blocked, and the Ukrainians lost their possibilities, some possibilities for logistic, for rotation, and many other different things. The situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians. Now they need to stretch their forces between the city of Pokrovsk and Kurakhova. Now let's move further, and we are going to talk about Chasiv Yar, where the Russians are about to finish the preparation before further offensive operation in direction of Chasiv Yar and to begin the Chasiv Yar pincer operation. As for the southern flank, according to different mappers, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions between Ivanovska, Seversky Donetsk, Donbas Canal, and the village of Klishchevka. This information was confirmed by different mappers, including Reliable. The Russians took under control the positions, the former positions of the 5th Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Most likely, the brigade was forced to fall back on the Ukrainian side of the canal, and currently the Russians are focused to take under control the last island on this side, and after this, the southern flank, the southern pincer, will be prepared before further movements in the western direction with the purpose to cut Chasiv Yar from supply and support along N32 road. As for the northern direction, during the previous days, we were talking a lot about the Russian progress in the vicinity of Grigorovka, that the Russians captured dense network of the fortifications. Now the Russians are about to finish the battle for another complex network of trenches that located further in the western direction. As soon as the Russians are able to do this, they will cross Seversky Donetsk Donbas Canal and they will attack Chasiv Yar from the north. Furthermore, don't forget that the Russians are increasing almost every day and intensifying their pressure from the east to the west along the central street. This is going to be a very interesting battle. While the Ukrainians are focused on the protection of Pokrovsk, while the Ukrainians are focused on saving their positions on the territory of Kursk region, while the Ukrainians are trying to slow the Russians down in the South Donetsk direction, while the Ukrainians are focused on the battle for Toretsk, the Russians are about to finish two more battles, the footholds of two more battles. We are talking about Zaporizhzhia, that we've been discussing this 5 minutes ago, and the battle for Chasiv Yar. Now let's move further. As for Sivers direction, we have the same story. The Russians are bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces along the main lines between the village of Saka and Vanseti, Pirezhny, and further in the north in the directions to Sivers. The Russians have already destroyed and bombed almost every single square kilometer. We can increase the numbers of updates, and obviously the updates and marks are completely in Russian favor. Since the beginning of August, almost every single square millimeter of this territory was attacked and bombed by the Russians, including the city of Verkhnya Kamyanska. This is the most important, the biggest painful of the Russians. They still haven't found a solution how to walk through the city. This is a very powerful, very important defense belt, stronghold, and the reason of why this stronghold is so powerful, the Ukrainians in this direction controls the Bila Gora. This is the highest point in this direction, and the Russians and the Ukrainians have complex network of trenches right on the territory of this, let's say, rock or hill, and the Russians neither can take under control these positions, neither move further in the western direction. But anyway, the Russians are searching for a solution. Obviously, it will take time while the Russians are going to find a key how to crack this nut, but obviously this is going to happen. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but most likely by the end of the year, we're going to see completely different configuration of the line of combat contact in this direction. The Ukrainians are trying to slow the Russians down as much as possible, and for these purposes they continue using their newly created weapon, flamethrowers, drones. This is something unique and something interesting that Ukrainians invented. Currently we still haven't seen a Russian analog or something like this. I would like to point your attention that in this video we see that drone is flying above Russian positions, and then we can see a secondary detonation. This is secondary detonation. These are bullets. These are bullets that were burned and activated as a result of FPV drone attacks. So once again, we've been discussing, or is the Russians who are trying to bring the drone down. So a lot of possible things. Anyway, the trenches were completely destroyed, and the Russians were forced to find the other way how to improve their territories and their strongholds. Now let's move further. Let's talk about another Russian breakthrough in the vicinity of Makeivka. The Ukrainian sources published a video how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian forces with a significant number of armored vehicles and the personnel. Some of the vehicles were damaged and destroyed by the Ukrainians during the Russian attack. Some of them managed to survive. We have another geolocations, and if we go to back to map, we have additional progress on the ground. After the Russians finished this attack, some of the forces were wounded and they were forced to move back towards the mainland, and the Ukrainians were trying to hunt the Russians somewhere in the fields on the Ukrainian side of Zhiribets River. So this video confirms additional Russian progress, and we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. And the Ukrainians are saying that the Russian armed forces have advanced north of Makeivka. The Ukrainian armed forces are transferring additional reserves to the area, which include many volunteers and mercenaries. So the situation is very difficult, but I'll remind you that this is the territory of under responsibilities of the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov. As for the northern Kupiansk direction, we see that the flower of Pishana continue blooming. We have additional changes on the ground around the village. So currently the Ukrainians still haven't found a solution how to stop the Russians. And the Russians are not in a hurry to move further in the western direction. First, they decided to take under control everything around Pishane to improve their positions, to get more territories, and then they will rush in the direction of the river of Oskol, forcing the Ukrainians to fall back. So this is also very interesting direction that is completely covered with the fog of war. There are lots of updates, events, the territories under very heavy fire from the Russian side, from the Russian artillery, but almost nothing interesting changes on the ground. So it's like the war of attrition, and the Ukrainians are suffering losses, but the Ukrainians are forced to bring more and more forces in this area, trying to stabilize the line and not to allow the Russians to break through the situation on the ground. As for the Kursk direction, we have additional icons, additional events. There are very heavy clashes right now. Zelensky is trying to hold their Ukrainian positions in Sudzha direction because he have prepared the plan. He have prepared the plan that he is going to show Biden, and his plan means that Ukraine agrees to ceasefire on some front lines and temporary freeze in plan Zelensky will hand over to Biden, Harris, and Trump. Zelensky now wants to put everything on one card and try to achieve a turning point on the battlefield, for which he needs a decision from President Biden, which shows how great the desperation is in Ukraine. There is no point in hoping for any progress here. His plan also contains Ukraine's demand for permission to use Western weapon on targets deep inside the Russian Federation. So a lot of things Zelensky wants from Biden, and the most important, he wants to change the course direction for something. Maybe Zelensky wants to change the course direction for let's say stopping attacks from the Russian side of energy facilities. Because the Ukrainians understand that they will not be able, Ukraine will stop exist by the end of the winter of 2024. The country will stop exist because population will leave the country. Everybody understands it. Zelensky understands this as well. He wants to change the territory of Sudzha in exchange for complete absence of any attack from the Russian side on the energy facilities. But on the other hand, Zelensky wants to save the permission and authorization to attack deep inside of territory of Russia and to attack military objects. So he thinks that it's very tricky or something like this, but the Russians don't think that this is very tricky. The Russians began full-scale offensive operation on the western flank of Sudzha direction, trying to take this card from Zelensky's hand and to reduce any chances from his side for any positive negotiations with the United States of America. Today we have additional changes on the ground in Russian favor. According to different mappers, the Russians reached the river. There are very heavy clashes right now in the territory of Lyubimovka, and this is the territory of the turning point. Who wins the battle for Lyubimovka will win a significant part of the battle for Sudzha, because if the Russians are able to move further in the western direction and to take this intersection of the roads between Lyubimovka, Zelený Shlях, and Nova Ivanovka, and to force the Ukrainians to fall back further to the border, the Russians will be able to cut the Ukrainians that are located in the northern part. And there are still a lot of Ukrainians, there are still a lot of Ukrainians. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians were attacking the abandoned Ukrainian vehicles. Probably they were abandoned a long time ago, and the Russians don't have possibilities to take these vehicles. They decided to destroy them because they were mined. We continue receiving updates from Ukrainian side of how they were FPV droning the Russian forces, which confirms additional changes on the ground from the Russian side. We have lots of updates. There are lots of forces, and the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to retreat because they begin retreating process. The entire direction can collapse, and the Russians on the Ukrainian soldier can move even further in the direction of Sudzha. As for the city of Sudzha itself, we continue we start receiving first updates of how the Russians began bombing the city with FAB. So the Russians were trying to avoid this method to bomb the cities of Russian Federation with FAB, but as I understand, the Russians have no choice. They need to, let's say, to prepare Sudzha before possible siege. The Ukrainians will try to hold this territory as long as possible, despite the losses, despite heavy losses the Ukrainians are suffering in this direction. We have a lot of videos with burned and destroyed Ukrainian equipment along the road, artillery systems, vehicles, supply machines that were destroyed as a result of Russian FPV drone attacks. We have lots of casualties from the Ukrainian side in this area, and they continue suffering them. As for the south eastern direction, the Russian sources reported that they managed to establish complete control over the village of Borky. The Russian soldiers published 2 videos how they were raising the flag, and this video we have Russian soldiers, and they were stating that they took under control the village of Borky, but telling the truth, it's impossible to geolocate these 2 videos. According to these guys, the video was made on the territory of the edge positions of the village of Borky, but based on these trees, it's impossible to geolocate where exactly they were raising the flag. So that's why we continue keeping the village of Borky in the contested area until anybody can geolocate the exact position of the Russians with the flag. The Ukrainians understand that they need to hold their positions in Sudzha as long as possible, so that's why they began another suicide operation in direction of Glushkova. And today we have additional updates, but the most important, we have updates that all reports from Ukrainian side that the village of Veselye was captured by the Ukrainians were just speculations and wishful thinkings. In this video we can see Ukrainian attack with United States bomb, and as a result of attack with the United States bomb, the Ukrainians destroyed the school in the village of Veselye. Most likely the school was occupied by the Russian soldiers, but anyway, furthermore, we have additional changes on the ground. According to pro-Russian mappers, the Ukrainians control currently around 50% of Veselye, and the Ukrainians entered the village of Medvezhzhia, so just probably 50% of the village is already under complete Ukrainian control, but we are not changing the map until we get more reliable confirmations. Anyway, once again, and the most very important, Zelensky is waiting for authorization from the United States of America to get permission to attack the Russia deep inside with long-range missiles. And as you can see, Joe Biden still hasn't authorized Ukraine to do this. And it seems that NATO countries, very smart people from the United States of America, were waiting for Russian reply, or were waiting for something from Russian side that will make them think that they were correct, that they didn't allow the Ukrainians to use long-range missiles. And probably we got today the answer. We got today the situation that most likely will change completely the minds of NATO countries and NATO leaders and leaders of the United States of America. And we are talking about the use of hypersonic missiles in the Middle East. Today, as you know, the Houthi attacked the territory of Israel with a hypersonic missile. And later they published the video of the use of ballistic hypersonic missiles. And we need to understand one thing. You need to understand, everybody needs to understand one thing. That Houthi, these guys with the flip-flop forces, as we used to call them, they couldn't create this technology. They don't know how to create this technology right now, and most likely during the next probably 500 years they will not be able to create these technologies by themselves. Obviously this technology was transferred to them by somebody. Of course, this technology was transferred to Houthi through Iran, most likely, but we need to understand that Iran received this technology from Russia. And the main purpose of this hypersonic ballistic missile strike on the territory of Israel when this missile fly through the territories above the significantly big United States fleet that is located in this area. The rockets missiles went through around 2,000 kilometers and attacked the Tel Aviv, the airfield Ben Gurion. And the thing is that the Israeli air defense haven't even noticed this missile. So this is the answer, and this is the final warning. This is the final argument of Russia to the Western countries, saying the following: if you provide Ukrainians, if you authorize Ukraine to attack deep inside of territory of Russia, Russia will authorize every single person in the world to use hypersonic missile to attack whatever they like all over the entire world, not just in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and Southern America, in the Northern America as well. Everybody will receive this technology, and everybody will start begin using these missiles everywhere, and you will not be able to do anything with this. And then we'll see who is able to deal more damage, Ukraine with their long-range missiles, or different people all over the world, different organizations with this hypersonic weapon. Obviously, there are a lot of things to think about for the Western countries, and obviously they will make the right decisions. And that's it for today. Military Summary Channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes, share my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.